I want to let you know that we're recording this webinar so that we can put it on the CV Stack website. We've learned that the invitation for the webinar for some people went to their junk mail. And so there's some people that wanted to attend that are not here. So this will give them a chance to listen to the webinar elsewhere. Before we begin, I want to introduce Jen Gazzillo. She's the UMassSafe Associate Director, and Ben Roney-Yeager, who's a UMassSafe Project Coordinator. They did most of the work in designing and implementing the survey. Unfortunately, our statistician was not able to join us today. But if you guys have questions that we're not able to answer, we will reach out to her and get back to you and answer some of those questions. Jen, Ben, and I are not the data experts, so there may be some questions that you have that we can't answer. So today we're going to share the results with you of really part one of the survey findings, understanding safety beliefs and behaviors of drivers of large trucks. And we're continuing to do some further analysis, and so that we may share a part two later if we find some things that are particularly interesting. A couple thank yous before we start. I'd like to thank Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for funding this project. I'd like to thank Rich Bates and John Toto and Taft Kelly for all their guidance and support in helping us develop the survey and giving feedback along the way, etc. I'd like to thank Jen and Ben, my coworkers, who did so much to make this happen. We're going to try to hold questions till the end just because there's so much to share, and we want to make sure that we have time for some discussion at the end. So I encourage you to jot your questions down as you have them, and we will definitely get to those at the end. So let me just give you a little bit of background on the survey before we share the results. This was an online anonymous survey of large truck drivers to gather input on their safety beliefs and behaviors. We had over 1,000 responses from commercial motor vehicle drivers in the Eastern Service Center region. We also collected results from drivers in other parts of the country to see if there were any differences, and we'll share a little bit about that, but we're still doing some analysis of those findings. It's worth noting that everything that we'll share today is self-reported. So this is what drivers told us about their beliefs and their behaviors. And we asked them about really 4 topics: texting while driving, exceeding hours of service regulations, alcohol use, and cannabis use. And what we'll do is we'll share what the drivers said about their behaviors related to these, and then their beliefs related to these, and the relationship between those two when there is something interesting to share. We distributed the survey really in 2 ways. We had a panel acquisition company. So they distribute surveys using their existing sample based on some credentials that we established to make sure that we were getting at CMV drivers. And then, interestingly, we also distributed the survey through Facebook. This was surprising. I didn't anticipate this to be as successful as it was, but I think we got to a different group of truck drivers, and I think we got some really interesting, honest feedback. I don't know if you've ever looked at any of the trucker Facebook pages, but they're exceptionally honest and outspoken. And we pilot tested the survey first in order to kind of test it out and work out some of the kinks. So we were looking for drivers who were primarily driving in the Eastern Service Center and had a Class A or B license, and at least 50% of their work was driving large or heavy trucks. And we used a screening question to make sure that we were getting at real truck drivers and not other folks that perhaps wanted to complete the survey. And we had needed to get consent from them to complete the survey. And this is some demographics of the respondents. I won't go into all the details, but I think what you can see here is that there was a lot of variance in age, in years of experience, in truck type, in fleet size, and it's pretty representative of large truck drivers as a whole. So I think we reached the right audience. So let's talk about some of the results. To begin with, as you can see, nearly 20% of the respondents self-reported that they'd been in at least one crash in the past year. And almost 10% self-reported that they had received at least one moving violation in the last year. And almost 60% had been involved in a roadside safety inspection. So let's take a look at that a little bit deeper. Let's look at the crash involvement. So of those who reported being involved in a crash, the majority said that they'd only been involved in one crash in the past year. And the rest of this slide depicts things that we found about those drivers. Large truck drivers aged 36 to 45 were most likely to have been in the crash, followed by those drivers with 5 to 15 years of experience. The other thing that we found is that drivers of extra large carriers and owner-operators were the least likely to have been involved in a crash. And then following up on the moving violations in the past 12 months, as we said before, 90%, a little bit over 90%, reported no moving violations in the last 12 months, and 9% reported receiving at least one violation. And as you can see here, most of them received only one. One of, I think, the most interesting findings of the survey is that drivers who reported any moving violations of any kind were also more likely to report that they exceed the hours of service rules. So these were their self-reported driver behaviors. We asked them in the last 3 months, had they engaged in any of these behaviors? So nearly 44% of large truck drivers reported texting while driving in the last 3 months. That's a lot. 35% reported exceeding hours of service regulations, but only 3% reported driving after consuming alcohol or cannabis. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through each of those behaviors, texting, hours of service, alcohol, and cannabis, and tell you a little bit about what we found. So as I said before, nearly 44% of the respondents said that they had texted in the last 3 months. And of those, drivers with 5 to 15 years of driving experience reported texting more often, most often, while drivers 26 to 35 years old reported the least often. So let's look at that a little bit more. This figure illustrates the relationship between driver experience and the frequency of texting while driving. And it controls for age and gender and truck type and driving schedule. And so what we see here is that drivers with 30 plus years of experience had the highest frequency of never texting. So that's 71%, this right here. But they still said, even though they still said that, that they rarely or sometimes texted. And then we looked at drivers that were, had 5 to 15 years of experience, and they had the highest frequency of often texting while driving, and that was 11%. And then we looked at age, driver's age, and we can see that 36 to 65-year-olds all reported low frequencies of never driving. So at least half of these drivers said that at least at some point they had texted while driving. So let's talk a little bit about the beliefs of the drivers around texting. So the survey respondents felt that crash risk increases when texting while driving, 85%. So there seems to be a lot of understanding about the risk associated with texting. And 68% felt that they were likely to be stopped by law enforcement for texting. They don't think that their supervisors don't care about texting while driving. Interestingly, as you might have expected, those who did the negative behavior, those who texted, also disagreed more significantly about the crash risk or being stopped by police or their supervisor's approval. So those that engaged in texting also felt that it was less dangerous. And I think that's what we would have expected. So let's look at that a little bit more. This slide depicts the driver characteristics and their negative and their positive safety beliefs regarding texting while driving. So pro-safety findings are on the right side, thumbs up. So those with 30 plus years of experience or extra large fleets rightfully acknowledge crash risk while texting, while driving. But long-haul drivers are less likely to agree that they'll be stopped by law enforcement for texting while driving. So now let's talk about hours of service and what the behaviors and the beliefs were that we found in the survey, and also how they relate to some of the other behaviors. So as we said earlier, slightly more than a third of the drivers who are completing the survey reported exceeding the hours of service regulations in the last 3 months. And the rest of the slide shows the characteristics of those who engaged in that behavior. Oops, sorry. There we go. So those with 5 to 15 years of experience and long-haul drivers were those that were most likely to report exceeding hours of service regulations. And those that report exceeding of hours of service are more likely to have received roadside inspections and have crash involvement. And those with more years of experience and those from extra large fleets reported that they were less likely to exceed hours of service rules. I think that's interesting to think about what extra large fleets do and how that might change behavior. Let's take a look at that a little bit more. So reiterating the findings of the previous slide, drivers with 5 to 15 years of experience are most likely, compared to other experienced groups, to exceed the hours of service regulations. And that's this group right here. And then when examining fleet size, extra large fleets had the highest frequency of reporting never exceeding the hours of service rules. And that's here. So now let's look at the respondents' beliefs regarding hours of service. What do they think? As you can see, only 45% of the drivers that completed the survey said that they agree that exceeding hours of service increases crash risk. That's significantly lower than what we saw about texting. Only slightly more than half believe that they'll be stopped by law enforcement for exceeding hours of service. So compared to other safety topics, this is the most disagreeable in terms of safety awareness. Drivers don't agree that hours of service improve safety, but inversely, they're more aware of the potential for enforcement. So let's look at their safety risk beliefs. This slide shows the characteristics and the demographics of those drivers, similar to what we showed about texting. And here, for example, we're able to hone in on owner-operators and drivers of small fleets disagreeing with the increased crash risk from exceeding hours of service. So combining the exceeding hours of service findings of reported behaviors, which is what we showed a couple slides ago, with these belief findings, we can loosely observe that drivers with 5 to 15 years of experience, those that are 46 to 65 years old, those with a long haul schedule, and owner-operators or small fleets are the ones that are most at risk for exceeding hours of service. And so combining some of this information about both behaviors and beliefs helps us look at who is at risk and who we might target in our work to try to prevent crashes involving large truck drivers. Now let's take a look at alcohol. The findings for alcohol and cannabis were very different in that the respondents reported very low usage. Only 3% said that they had driven after drinking alcohol in the last 4 hours or of consuming cannabis. However, it's still statistically significant that drivers of single-unit vehicles were more likely to consume alcohol within 4 hours of driving. So now let's look at their beliefs about driving after drinking. As one would expect, most conclusively of all the survey findings, reported alcohol use before driving was agreed to be a large crash risk, almost 90%. And that they were likely to be stopped by law enforcement, nearly 70%. Those that reported consuming alcohol before driving agreed with these less. So if we continue to take a look at those safety risk beliefs and the demographics of those folks, interestingly, the belief patterns with regard to crash risk, enforcement, and supervisor disapproval for driving after drinking and for texting while driving are similar, with a large understanding of the risk. So drivers seem to really understand the risk of texting while driving, as well as drinking while driving. And it'll be interesting for us to think about those two in combination later as we think about what are we going to do about texting, what are we going to do about driving after drinking as we work on trying to prevent crashes. Those with 30 plus years of experience acknowledged the crash risk, but didn't agree with police enforcement or that super oversight was likely. And that was true for cannabis also. So the last behavior that we asked drivers in the survey about was cannabis use. And as we described earlier, only 3% of large truck drivers reported driving after consuming cannabis. Now, there's a potential risk here for underreporting because we're asking drivers to admit to an illegal behavior, something that is against regulation. But there's some evidence to show that there's some real accuracy in self-reporting because of an increased trust in the public research methods. Within that 3%, we did find that long-haul drivers were more likely to drive after consuming cannabis than short-haul drivers. However, because only 3% reported driving after consuming cannabis at all, the sample here is small. So let's take a look at the drivers' responses around their beliefs about cannabis. Interestingly, respondents agreed slightly less often that they would be stopped by law enforcement when driving after consuming cannabis than driving after drinking alcohol or texting. But those that reported consuming cannabis felt that the crash risk was less and that they would be less likely to be stopped by police. So again, let's look at the demographics of those that reported their beliefs about cannabis. As one might expect, owner-operators don't feel like their supervisors would care. Well, perhaps that's because they don't have supervisors, they're the owners. Those with moving violations or roadside inspections don't think their supervisors will care about cannabis use. And an underlying trend was that many positive safety beliefs being reported from drivers of extra large fleets. So we're really seeing some safety behavior that's quite different among drivers of extra large fleets. And that was true for all the behaviors that we looked at. Here for cannabis use, they agreed more than other fleet types that it would be enforced. So next we'll examine some cross-theme correlations. What do large truck drivers who report driving after cannabis use also do in terms of safety risks. And so as we looked at these two behavioral factors simultaneously, using cross-tabulations, we found that 95% of drivers reported no use of either alcohol or cannabis. That's here. While 1% reported using both. So overall, these results show that even drivers that never engage in alcohol or cannabis will still engage in other risky behaviors. So here we're looking at those that don't consume alcohol, don't consume cannabis, sorry. But they still engage in exceeding hours of service regulations, and they still engage in texting. And here, the same thing. Almost a third of those that don't drive after consuming alcohol report exceeding hours of service and exceeding texting. So what's the takeaway there? Although cannabis and alcohol consumption prior to driving is of concern, it's not a reliable indicator for other behaviors such as texting or hours of service, because people who are going to do these behaviors regardless. But of those who do engage in cannabis or do drink alcohol within 4 hours before driving, it is still a significant predictor of other safety risks. So for example, drivers that consume alcohol are nearly 15 times more likely to drive after consuming cannabis. They're nearly 3 times as likely to exceed hours of service regulations. And they're nearly 2 times as likely to text while driving. And drivers that consume cannabis are 2 times as likely to exceed hours of service regulations. So in a few minutes, we're going to ask you for some input on what to do about these survey results. And I think, this is a slide and this is some information that we really can use as we're thinking about that. So I encourage you to be thinking about the individual behaviors as well as the behaviors together and the risk predictors as we try to think about what we want to do with these findings in order to continue to try to reduce crash risk. The last cross-theme correlation is looking at hours of service and texting. And in here we see that 45% of all drivers report that they've never texted and that they've never exceeded hours of service regulations, while 25% said that they did both. So drivers that report exceeding hours of service are 2 times as likely to also report texting. One tangent that we went off on preliminarily was looking at different states and regions, so that these small geographic areas, what were the characteristics of the drivers there? So on the top, we see the safety risk topics and the percent in the corresponding cell of those drivers who disagreed with the topic. So they disagreed with increasing crash risk. These are the naysayers. And then on the bottom, we see the same topics with the percent who admit to any level of doing the negative behavior. This particular analysis has not been statistically tested, but it gives you a sense of where certain beliefs and behaviors are more common. So for example, those drivers that are driving through Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont disagreed most strongly that texting is dangerous. However, they had the second lowest percent rate of admitting to texting and driving. So that's this here. Where alternatively, drivers that were driving through Virginia and West Virginia had the most disagreement with exceeding hours of service, increasing their crash risk. And their reported behavior was also the most frequent. So if we want to go into specific states and develop programming, not just for the Eastern Service Center as a whole, but for some smaller regions, we can look at this to decide what we want to target in what states. So some summary. Honoring the statistical rules of what should or shouldn't be considered significant, we're able to really confidently acknowledge these trends as being overrepresented or more likely to occur. So interestingly, it is drivers with 5 to 15 years of experience that are texting and are not abiding by hours of service regulations. But those with 30 plus years of experience that are driving after using alcohol or cannabis, even though the numbers of those that are doing that are lower. The other driver characteristics seem to vary more by behavior. So we'll need to target specific behaviors with specific age groups. And then I think it's really important not to just look at what drivers are doing wrong, but also what drivers are doing well and what seems to be working. So interestingly, it is drivers aged 26 to 35 that are not texting and that are not drinking before driving. And it's drivers of extra large fleets that are not engaging in any of these risky behaviors. So perhaps one of the things that we want to do is share with people what drivers are doing well and how we can encourage those behaviors among other drivers. So those are our findings, at least of part 1. And as we do more analysis, we'll share with you those findings. And we really wanted to ask you now, do you have questions, first of all? And then second of all, what do you think we should do with these findings? How can we use this information to develop programming to prevent crashes involving large truck drivers? And so I encourage you to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself or chat any questions or thoughts you have about the findings as a whole, or questions about the findings, or how you think, and most importantly, how you think we should use these findings. I fear this is going to be a quiet group, but I hope you'll have some comments to share with us. What do you think? I don't know why, but on webinars, everybody is often very quiet and doesn't have questions.
Hey, Robin. Oh,
go for it, Rich.
Question, and I don't know if the study, but on some of those ones where it talked about like the texting and the hours of service, is there anything to say as to like why they were doing it?
So why they were texting while they're driving?
Yeah, so I mean, like the texting, was it like, were they trying to keep in touch with, family members? Was it the company, texting them, similar with the hours of service, like were they violating the hours of service because, they were being forced, or was their decision, kind of like some of the whys to some of the numbers would be interesting.
Yeah, really good question. We struggled so much when we were developing the survey with what to ask, because we felt like we had to keep the survey really short. So we didn't ask that question. However, we are going to do a part 2 of the survey where we're going to look at norms among the whys among the drivers, the norms among the drivers in order to try to understand some next steps. And we're very excited that we've just been funded by Federal Motor Carrier to do that second survey. So we don't know the answer to that. And I think it's really important to find out, will the drivers tell us why they text? Will they tell us why they don't abide by the hours of service regulations? I think, the one thing that we saw in the response to the questions is many don't feel, for example, that the hours of service regulations increase safety. And so that's probably a reason why they then don't abide by them. But I think there are probably other reasons too. And I think we need to get at those. I think you're asking, Rich, exactly what we want to know next.
Looks like Terry Thompson has her hand up. If you'd like to unmute yourself, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to, get an opinion or some more information. I attended a recent after action review for a tractor trailer crash, and we had the Department of Motor Vehicle there, and the discussion came up on cannabis use, quite honestly, that under federal regulation, it's illegal, but there are states where it is legal. So it's becoming kind of, I guess, a conundrum as to exactly how is this going to be navigated from the federal side.
I wonder if one of our federal attendees would like to address that question.
And it kind of all ties back to the idea that when it's tied to a federal regulation, it's tied to their livelihood. It's their job, and it's, it's, even though a state regulation may underseed it, it's still, if they were to lose their job because their company discovered that they were tested positive for cannabis, that's really a motivating factor.
And I think part of Terry's question is, if it's illegal, if it's against federal regulation for a large truck driver to drive after using cannabis, but they're in a state where cannabis is legal, what do the regulations mean for them? Rich, would you be willing to answer that question?
Sure. I mean, when you say if they're out, like, our regulations apply to specific drivers, CDL. Well, actually, for marijuana use, it's actually anything over 10,000, but that gets into interstate. So it really depends upon the nature and operation of the business. So, a company coming from, California to Massachusetts, that's an interstate company. So they would be subject regardless of what the Massachusetts regulations allow. Now, a tow truck company operating, a smaller vehicle driving from Boston to Worcester, they would fall under the Massachusetts regulations and not so much ours. So it really depends upon the operation of the company. But if they're subject to the federal regulations, it really doesn't matter what the state regulations are at that time.
Okay, so Richard, what you're saying is basically that the federal regulations supersede any state. And it mostly, yeah, because we have, it's interstate and intrastate travel with some commercial vehicle carriers, and it was our commercial vehicle squad that had brought up, that issue.
Right.
Here.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, it really depends upon, the interstate versus the intrastate is really going to make a decision on whose regulations truly apply. But, if a state allows marijuana use and it's an interstate company, then the federal regulations are going to override that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Some of the questions and the comments that you're asking and describing are going to help us design the questions for the next survey. So I think, Rich, your comments about why will definitely be part of the next survey. And Terry, I think we ought to ask drivers, do they understand that the federal regulations supersede the state regulations?
Absolutely agree, because I think there's going to be some contesting on that as to who's right, who's wrong. I'm driving in Connecticut and I can, but I came from Ohio where I can't. So it becomes the whole cannabis issue is becoming a real problem for a lot of our traffic incident management stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I would have thought of that as a potential question for the next survey. So I'm really glad you asked, because I think it's an important one.
Oh, a chat just came in from Marianne. Ask drivers if they have cameras in their truck, forward facing, driver facing. And that leads me right into what I was going to comment on about we need to know what these extra large carriers are doing well, and then take those ideas that they're doing well and translate them on a smaller scale to the small carriers that that Terry is going to have problems with intervening with, because it's the small carriers that don't have that large structure of an organization to explain to them the rules on cannabis and the rules on the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. It's these smaller carriers that don't have that infrastructure, that built-in safety net features. So I think that's a great point, Marianne.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Any thoughts on how we should use these findings? You know, the Eastern Service Center region as a whole, the Northeast, what kinds of things could we do based on what we've learned about the attitudes and behaviors of large truck drivers?
Oh, we have another question from Stephen Habrowski. What type of advanced driver assistance systems are equipped in the vehicle they utilize? So another suggestion for a question, I believe. And that falls under the line of the cameras as well, too. So those are really good questions to include there.
And unfortunately, I think anecdotally out there, it's only the extra large carriers that can afford to have advanced driver assistance systems and forward facing cameras and safety monitoring to that level. So we're going to keep creating this stretch between the small mom and pop owner operators and these large ones when there's going to be two different levels of technology.
Mm-hmm.
When it actually comes to the technology piece, yes, there is some of it of what we think of is expensive to go on the vehicles. And the larger carriers are the ones that can afford it. But there's actually new technology is coming out where it is not as expensive to input into vehicles and retrofit. So it is becoming more affordable.
It'll be interesting to see as that happens, whether that changes the attitudes and behaviors of drivers. If instead of just seeing the extra drivers of extra large fleets as you know, having stronger safety beliefs and behaviors, whether that correlates and whether we start to see an increase in the safety attitudes and behaviors of drivers of smaller fleets.
It's Terry Thompson again. I just wanted to offer something about the cameras. We just had an after action review regarding a tractor trailer incident on the highway, and they had a forward facing camera, and it proved to them that a vehicle cut off the tractor trailer, and that is why he rolled over. If they did not have that forward facing camera, it would have been a he said, she said, so to speak, with the investigator. But I asked them about that, and I also asked some of our traffic incident management trainers. They said a lot of vehicles now are going with forward-facing cameras of some sort, whether it's a GoPro or something like that, because it protects them also in case of incidents. So I just wanted to bring that out there, that more and more are using it.
Excellent point. Thanks, Terry.
And these are professional drivers, and they really do stand by their skill. They're experienced. Like, so many of them are very adamant about prioritizing their safety. So if we can empower them by giving them that, then what do they have to hide? Because they're just documenting their own professional driving skills. That would be a great tangent to run on, disseminating education to them.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So we're going to post the presentation on the CV Stack website. Maybe, Ben, you could type the web address for CV Stack into the chat. So if you have colleagues that were not able to participate in the webinar, they can go and listen to it on the CV Stack website. We did hear that there were some problems with the promotion of the webinar and it ending up in spam for a lot of folks. And so as they've been finding out about it, they've been asking us, well, you know, how can we get this information? So please feel free to share that with your colleagues. If you have other ideas for things that could either be asked in this next survey or other ideas for ways that we can use the survey results to promote safety, I encourage you to reach out to Jen, Ben, or myself. We'd love to hear from you. You already gave us a lot of ideas for things to add to the next survey that I had not thought about. So I really appreciate your input and your time. And feel free to reach out to us if you have other ideas. So thanks very much and have a great day.
Hey, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.